History as it happens, December 7th, 2023. From Beirut to Gaza City.
The Israeli armed forces have completed preparations for a military attack into Lebanon.
Around the Lebanese capital. This strike.
The stillness of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and planes.
I have read in some newspapers in this great country that Israel invaded Lebanon. This is a misnomer. Israel did not invade any country.
What is at stake now in the invasion of Lebanon is the future of Lebanon itself, its territorial integrity, its independence, and its sovereignty.
Millions of us have seen pictures of the Palestinian victims of this tragedy. There's little that words can add, but there are actions we can and must take to bring that nightmare to an end.
Urban warfare with the aim of destroying a terrorist enemy, a mountain of civilian corpses, international outcry, and in the end, failure. The 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon was a disaster for all involved. Today, Israel is trying to make war work again, this time in Gaza, attempting to destroy Hamas after its fighters butchered, raped, and kidnapped Israelis on October 7th. There may be some parallels here. There are important differences. But what these wars, separated by more than 40 years, may share in common is the futility of violence in resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. That's next as we report history as it happens. A podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Israel's military trying to keep the focus on the massacre that sparked the war.
Israel has intensified its military operations in the south of the Gaza Strip.
The terrorist group Hamas unleashed pure, unadulterated evil in the world. But sadly, the Jewish people know perhaps better than anyone that there is no limit to the depravity of people when they want to inflict pain on others.
It is possible that Israel could greatly degrade Hamas, kill a number of its leaders, destroy a lot of its tunnels. I don't think it's realistic to be able to eliminate Hamas, certainly as a movement or as a fighting force.
On September 20th, 1982, President Ronald Reagan spoke directly to the American people in a nationally televised address from the Oval Office about scenes of death and carnage that caused moral outrage across the world.
But there are actions we can and must take to bring that nightmare to an end. It's not enough for us to...
Lebanese Christian militias had massacred more than 2,000 Palestinian men, women, and children, some of whom were tortured and raped in the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in West Beirut. The Israeli Defense Forces let the Phalangist militiamen into the area as they sought revenge for the assassination of Lebanese Prime Minister Bashir Gemayel.
Shattered buildings, broken bodies. This is the horrific aftermath of the Beirut massacre, when several hundred defenseless Palestinians...
Israel must have learned that there is no way it can impose its own solutions on hatreds as deep and bitter as those that produced this tragedy. If it seeks to do so, it will only sink more deeply into the quagmire that looms before it.
It's not often when Americans hear their president directly, publicly criticize Israel. Reagan had already tore into Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin in private, as we now know, that summer as the IDF bombarded Beirut in a siege that would kill thousands of civilians. Reagan told Begin, according to historian William Inboden in his book, The Peacemaker, in one tense phone call, Reagan told Begin that Israel's bombardment was causing a Holocaust in Beirut. This infuriated Begin, writes Inboden, whose parents and brother were murdered in the Holocaust. He responded, "Don't teach me about Holocausts. I and my people know very well what Holocaust means." Soon afterward, Begin wrote to Reagan hinting at Israel's intention to kill Yasser Arafat, saying, "I have sent an army to Berlin to wipe out Hitler in the bunker."
Everybody of you knows that we face now a situation in the Middle East which calls for activity, great attention, and understanding. I have read in some newspapers in this great country that Israel invaded Lebanon. This is a misnomer. Israel did not invade any country. You do invade a land when you want to conquer it, or to annex it, or at least to conquer part of it. We don't covet even 1 inch of Lebanese territory, and willingly we will withdraw our troops, all of our troops, and bring them back home as soon as possible.
Israel invaded Lebanon for some of the same reasons Israel invaded Gaza this October, although the 1982 war was not triggered by a massive terrorist attack on Israeli civilians. We'll cover the triggering event of the 82 war in my conversation with Paul Salem in a moment. Israel went into Lebanon 41 years ago to try to eliminate armed factions of the militant PLO. These guerrilla units had for years used southern Lebanon as a base to fire rockets into Israel and attack Israeli towns. The IDF wanted to create a buffer zone in southern Lebanon free of Palestinian terrorists. But Defense Minister Ariel Sharon and Prime Minister Begin also had plans to go all the way to Beirut and install a pro-Israel Maronite Christian as Lebanon's leader, the aforementioned Bashir Gemayel, whose assassination led to the Sabra and Shatila revenge killings. Israel also hoped that by routing the PLO in Lebanon, it would isolate Palestinians in the West Bank, thereby accelerating the annexation of the West Bank into Israel. In an essay in Foreign Affairs, Johns Hopkins University political scientist Sarah Parkinson writes, "The similarities between Israel's invasion of Lebanon and its operations in Gaza go beyond just the choice of tactics. Then as now, the invasion began after a shocking Palestinian attack. Then as now, Israel's hawkish leaders opted for a maximalist response. Then as now, much of the fighting took place in densely populated urban areas, with militants often interspersed among civilians. And then as now, the IDF used disproportionate force," she writes. "This parallel is not heartening. If Lebanon is any guide, Israel's war in Gaza today will end poorly for both Palestinians and Israelis. Despite its military superiority, Israel never succeeded in eradicating the PLO. Instead," Parkinson writes, "the IDF's primary accomplishments were killing tens of thousands of civilians, fragmenting Palestinian groups into smaller cells that spent years conducting hit-and-run operations, inspiring the rise of a new Lebanese militant party, Hezbollah, and losing over 1,000 of its own citizens in an occupation that stretched until 2000. Parkinson goes on to say it's a pattern that is already playing out again. As of November 12th, when the IDF's assault cut off communications with many Gazan hospitals, at least 11,000 Palestinian civilians had died due to the fighting, a figure that will keep rising. Indeed, as I speak into this microphone, Israeli officials say at least 5,000 Hamas militants have been killed. But that leaves the majority of its estimated 30,000-strong military wing intact. And it means at least 11,000 Palestinian civilians have been killed by Israel, mostly women and children, some by 2,000-pound bombs dropped in densely populated areas. The sheer ferocity of Israel's response and soaring death toll has led to an international outcry. As the New York Times reports, more women and children have been reported killed in Gaza than in Ukraine after 2 years of Russian belligerence. Whatever private reservations have been expressed inside the Biden administration, the president himself has not publicly admonished Israel, nor has Mr. Biden sought to use any of the United States' significant leverage to persuade Israel to limit civilian deaths.
The first war crime is being committed by Hamas by having their headquarters, their military, hidden under a hospital. And that's a fact. That's what's happened. Israel did not go in with large number of troops, did not raid, did not rush everything down. They've gone in, and they've gone in with their soldiers carrying weapons or guns. They were told, let me be precise. We've discussed the need for them to be incredibly careful. You have a circumstance where you know there is a fair number of Hamas terrorists. Hamas has already said publicly that they plan on attacking Israel again.
Whether you find these parallels or differences useful or not, it is worth listening to public officials 40 years ago, because what they said then could be said today, and you wouldn't know the difference. That's how little, in some respects, things have changed. For instance, Israel's ambassador to the UN in 1982 pleaded with that body to understand that Israel was just trying to defend itself from terrorists out to destroy it.
That this council has treated with callousness and indifference all these years, all our complaints with regard to PLO barbarism originating from Lebanon against Israel's civilians.
Well, as Parkinson writes in her essay, when all is said and done, it's unlikely Israel will knock out Hamas or Islamic Jihad. Instead, what Israeli decision-makers will discover is something they ought to have already understood and that regional experts have known for years. There is no military solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Paul Salem was in Lebanon 40 years ago. Today he is an expert on the region as the president of the Middle East Institute, the author and editor of many relevant books, including Escaping the Conflict Trap Toward Ending Civil Wars in the Middle East and Winning the Battle, Losing the War, addressing the conditions that fuel armed non-state actors. Paul Salem, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Myron. It's great to be on your show.
So how about we start with big picture, historical parallel here, because, I've often said history does not repeat itself. It does not rhyme, but there are some strong parallels here between 1982 and the current war. Do you agree that Israel's war in Gaza today is unlikely to achieve its desired aims, just as, in 1982, the IDF did not accomplish all of its aims?
First of all, it's a very interesting comparison to explore. There are a lot of parallels. There are certainly a lot of differences as well. So happy to delve into it. Where you ended the question, do I think that Israel will achieve its aims? It is possible that Israel could greatly degrade Hamas, kill a number of its leaders, destroy a lot of its tunnels. I don't think it's realistic to be able to eliminate Hamas, certainly as a movement or as a fighting force. Hamas can relocate to several locations. Gaza itself has proven very porous, given that they've been able to bring all kinds of military equipment, rockets, and other materials, even in the midst of a long siege by Israel and Egypt. So no, I don't think they'll achieve, the full aim, but they can achieve a lot of those aims. I think what's particularly different between the Gaza war and the Lebanon war of 82 is that the Lebanon war of 82 was part of a kind of a political plan, a political project that didn't work out either, but there was a plan politically. The Gaza war is largely a direct, largely emotional reaction to the massive and horrific attack by Hamas on Israel on October 7. The war has been launched without a political, really end game in mind. It's just a war to achieve a war aim, but as you know, wars end in something, and usually that needs to have a sustainable political structure, and that Israel doesn't even have much of a plan for that.
I'm glad you pointed out the differences, and we should always point out differences, not just similarities as well. Yes, today's aim is to eliminate Hamas as a security threat to Israel, but also it seems Israel is embarking on regime change in Gaza, but as you say, not with a concrete or clear plan on how to effect that when the fighting finally ends, and who knows how long the fighting will go on. Do you see it that way?
Well, I think, as far as Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, the main thing he said, he's trying to effect an occupation, an invasion, and he said the Israeli forces will remain there for at least the immediate term after the invasion is concluded or reaches its maximum limits or certain limits. We don't know how far they will actually go.
When will they determine, in other words, that they've killed enough of Hamas's people, destroyed enough of Hamas's infrastructure to be able to declare victory, right?
Yeah, that's a living question. They probably don't know the answer to that. The declared answer right now, similar to U.S. and Afghanistan, is destroy Hamas, like the U.S. said, destroy Al-Qaeda. Of course, Al-Qaeda, popped up in all kinds of places. Finally, the U.S. kind of accepted that maybe killing bin Laden was a time to declare victory, ended up withdrawing from Afghanistan largely in defeat with the Taliban taking over. So these wars might start kind of simply. They do start horrifically, certainly the Gaza war, the toll on Israelis initially, and then the much larger toll on innocent Palestinian civilians we've seen as well, but really not a very clear end point to the war so far.
And the 1982 war also was triggered by a Palestinian attack, but the Israelis had been waiting for an opportunity to deal with the Palestinian problem as they saw it in southern Lebanon. So we're going to get to that now. We're going to set up some context prior to the start of the 82 invasion, which was the second Israeli invasion of Lebanon, as we draw parallels between past and present. So we're going to start with, in the post-1948 world, Paul Salem. This may seem like an obvious question, but not everyone listening is a specialist in Middle Eastern history. Why were so many Palestinians living in Lebanon to begin with?
Well, I mean, going back to 1948, the moment that the British Mandate power left Palestine, Mandate Palestine, going back another 20 years, the British government had promised the Zionist movement, which was a European-based Zionist movement, Jewish movement, had promised them in 1917 in the Balfour Declaration that the British Empire would commit to establishing a Jewish homeland in Mandate Palestine. And so the Zionist movement began moving much more quickly into Palestine, buying properties, and so on. That already created tensions between, Jewish immigrants and so on, and the majority Arab population. There were protests and so on. In 1947, to be clear, the UN had proposed a partition plan. The Arabs had rejected the partition plan, so there was no really plan when the British left, kind of like when they left India. India erupted into civil war. When they left Palestine, Palestine erupted into civil war between the armed Zionist groups, Jewish armed groups, and then, armed Arab groups.
There had been fighting prior to the final exit of the British in 48. You referenced the partition vote at the UN in 47. There had been a civil war, if you will, going on in Palestine between Jews and Arabs. But yes, 48, the British exit, and they leave behind no governing authority. And that is when we get what is called the Nakba.
I mean, prior to the British leaving, there had been skirmishes, attacks, killings, but there was a governing force. There was the British Empire, British forces. So there wasn't, a civil war in any major sense. But when they left, it was a free-for-all. And as it turned out, the Zionist armed groups were much more effective, much more organized than the Arab civilians. And the Arab civilians relied on the Arab states, and the Arab states all immediately declared war on the Zionist armed groups and tried to come in to support Palestinians. In the midst of that, several 100,000 Arab Palestinians, some of them fled in fear, others were pushed out of their towns and villages as the armed Zionist groups quickly tried to take as much of Mandate Palestine as they could before the Arab forces came and they declared the State of Israel, all of that story. So, There was a few 100,000 Palestinians who either fled or were pushed out. Different villages and cities experienced different things. Went to Lebanon, went to Jordan, went to Syria, some went to Egypt. And that is, the origin story of now, several million Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Syria, citizens in Jordan, and some in Egypt.
Sarah Parkinson, writing in Foreign Affairs, says between 100,000 and 130,000 of the Palestinian refugees from 1948 fled to Lebanon. And they settled in what they believed at the time would be temporary Lebanese coastal towns, refugee camps for the poorest of the Arabs who fled Palestine. And eventually, in 1969, Lebanese and Palestinian authorities agreed to the Cairo Agreement, which ceded governance of the refugee camps, reading from Sarah Parkinson's article here, from a branch of Lebanon's intelligence services to the PLO. So we've established now why the Palestinians were in Lebanon. Paul, what kind of militant actions were the PLO undertaking against Israeli targets during these years in the 1970s?
Yeah, I mean, that's very important context. In 1967, there was obviously the 1967 war between Israel and Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. It was a tremendous defeat, particularly for Egypt, which was the biggest and the leader of that Arab coalition, led by a very popular leader called Jamal Abdel Nasser. That began a process where the Arab states no longer wanted to fight Israel and hence said, hey, you Palestinians here, will help you out. We'll give you a few guns and so you do it because we're getting out of that business. And that pressure fell on Jordan and Lebanon, countries where there were a lot of Palestinian refugees. In Jordan, that led to a brief armed conflict between the armed Palestinian groups there and the Jordanian government in September of 1970, known as Black September, particularly by the Palestinians, when the Jordanian military basically defeated and evicted the armed Palestinian, the armed PLO from Jordan. All of those came over to Lebanon to increase the problem for Lebanon of having armed Palestinian groups. And the Lebanese-Israeli border became the only border where there still was conflict, whereas, in most of the other borders, the states had recoiled from actually going to war. But Lebanon, being the weakest Arab state, couldn't really control its land or control its border. And both Egypt and Syria and others sort of said to the Palestinians, you go ahead and do your thing and do it from Lebanon. And indeed, that's what happened. And that led to years of attacks and counterattacks by PLO and other Palestinian groups on Israel, and Israel attacking back in Lebanon, attacking the airport, attacking camps, attacking various locations. So, yeah, it led to a deterioration of that situation. Internally in Lebanon, it led to a polarization in Lebanon and conditions that eventually led to the eruption of civil war in Lebanon in 1975.
So what was the aim of the PLO's actions against Israel during these years? So this is, Arafat is in charge of the PLO. At this point, he is still not interested in what we would call a two-state solution. He's, at this point, still dedicated to using violence to try to achieve Palestinian national aspirations, and he wants to reclaim the entire land of Palestine, not just part of it for an Arab state, right?
Yeah, in that period, that was still his position. That was the position of the PLO. PLO really had taken off in the 1960s. So this is still early days for the PLO. It's, barely 10 years into their existence. And certainly they were a militant, armed, radical nationalist movement. The Soviets also backed them to a considerable degree. This fell in, within the context of the Cold War as well, with the U.S. backing Israel, the Soviets backing the PLO and other forces. So there were a lot of layers to this. And yes, still at this point, the Palestinian national movement was fighting for all of Palestine. Now, all of Palestine included Jews, and, Jews in Palestine. So, all of Palestine, but Palestine that includes Jews and Arabs.
Why did Israel invade Lebanon in 1978? And what was the outcome of this very short, if you want to call it a war or incursion?
Well, 1978 was 3 years after the Lebanese state had effectively collapsed and ceased to exist in the midst of civil war in Lebanon. We've already said that the PLO and Israel were exchanging blows from the late 1960s through to 1978. So, it would escalate, de-escalate, escalate, de-escalate. And, within the logic of having a failed state next door, continued attacks from PLO and counterattacks from Israel, the decision was taken basically to create a buffer zone and push the PLO out of at least a big chunk of the south. So the logic of it was really the logic of a buffer zone and pushing the PLO, a number of kilometers up the road. Keep in mind at this time, we didn't have these ballistic missiles that the Iranians have brought into play. So a buffer zone worked. Most of the attacks were, overland attacks by people with machine guns and so on. So a buffer zone made sense. It makes less sense today.
Yeah, there are some parallels here. Recurring violence between Israel on the one hand and its enemies in, Gaza is an enclave. It's not a state. You can really say it's within Israel, if you want to call it a one-state reality. And back in the late 70s, early 80s, Lebanon, which was a failed state, so you had the PLO as a statelet or a quasi-government entity that had built up its governance and social services infrastructure in these refugee camps. And just as Israel has gone to war in Gaza several times since Hamas won the elections in 2006, right? There have been a number of outbreaks of violence over the past 15 years or so. Same situation here in the late 70s, early 80s. That 78 invasion was triggered by an attack by Fatah, which was the militant movement of the PLO, a bus hijacking that killed dozens of Israelis. So what lessons did Menachem Begin, who was the Israeli prime minister in 1982, what did he draw from that earlier invasion that he would try to apply to the 82 invasion, which was designed once and for all to solve the PLO problem?
Yeah, well, between 1978 and 1982, number of important, shifts. The most important one was the Camp David Accords and then the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. Since the establishment of the State of Israel, it was really Egypt which was the major threat. So once they had peace with Egypt, they felt that their hands were free to take care of other business and that they could go ahead and have an military adventure in Lebanon without worrying about the Egyptians. It really freed their hands in Lebanon. That's the main difference. Secondly, inside Lebanon, they had established connections with the leader of the Christian, if you can call militias Christian, which you shouldn't be able to, but Christian groups had formed militias fighting with Palestinian militias as well as a number of leftist and sort of Muslim majority militias in Lebanon. That was the part of the civil war that you talked about.
Yeah, the phalangists, right? They were a part of the Maronite movement.
Yeah, the Maronites, you're right. The Maronite Catholics are the largest Christian community in Lebanon. They formed a number of militias. One was the phalangists, and then there were two or three others. Then they were unified under something called the Lebanese Forces. And the leader of that was somebody called Bashir Gemayel. And in 80 and 81, the Israelis established very strong relations with Bashir Gemayel and devised a plan to have an invasion, push the PLO out of Lebanon, have Bashir Gemayel be elected president, and then Gemayel would sign a peace treaty with Israel and they'd win the whole kit and caboodle, as it were. Get the PLO out, have an allied state, sign peace.
Regime change.
Once and for all.
Yeah, regime change.
Yes, regime fiddling, regime evolution. I mean, the Lebanese system had always had a Maronite president. They were meddling in a way in the Lebanese elections to bring about an outcome that suited them. It didn't work out that way, but that was the plan.
Yeah,
so
we'll get
it
to
wasn't
that,
so much that Begin learned military lessons. It was that now he had the freedom to do something because Egypt was out. He thought he had a political plan in Lebanon because he had an ally. So within that political context, then the military operation was implemented.
And another aim of the 82 invasion, which we're going to get to right now, was to drive the PLO out of Lebanon so Israel could then isolate Palestinians on the West Bank to make the de facto annexation of the West Bank easier. What triggers the 82 war? It was an act of violence, right?
Well, that really was, really to be accurate, the Israelis seized on an attack. It was an attack on the Israeli ambassador in London.
That's right. He was assassinated, right?
Yeah, but the plan had been prepared and devised for a long time. They needed they couldn't just wake up one morning and launch an invasion.
Yeah.
That wouldn't go over well. Unlike the Gaza war, the Gaza war really is a genuine, ferocious reaction to the Hamas attack. The 82 invasion, they were waiting for something so that they could implement this plan, but this was a laid out plan. And they said, well, this is good enough. Let's use that. And they launched the invasion. So they're very different contexts. The 82 invasion was a very thought through, had a very clear end game. And because of the end game, they went ahead and did the military operation. Rather than what we have now in Gaza, you have a military operation in search of an end game.
In William Cleveland's A History of the Modern Middle East, he says one of the other lessons Begin drew from the 78 invasion was that the presence of Palestinian guerrillas in Lebanon cannot be eliminated by military action that confined itself only to southern Lebanon. As you say, there was a plan here to go all the way to Beirut and affect regime fiddling or regime change. But those designs were not made public, right? So when the 1982 war begins, the stated aim was to destroy the PLO and its infrastructure. But we wind up with this siege of Beirut, and this is Israel's longest military operation after independence. This 1982 war takes 3 months. So let's talk about the siege of Beirut. We can compare it to the ongoing siege of Gaza. In both cases, massive use of force, some would say disproportionate force, indiscriminate shelling and bombing, with the aim of limiting Israel's casualties rather than civilian casualties on the other side, because urban warfare is so difficult. Do you see a parallel there?
Well, there certainly are parallels. It was a long siege of a big city. My dad was in the city at the time. I was in the country. I wasn't in the city itself.
Oh, wow. No.
It was a very brutal siege. But I do think there are significant differences. One, in Lebanon, there was much more of an end game. So there was much more politics involved. Negotiations had started. It was obvious that at some point the PLO might have to leave Lebanon, and negotiations as to where they would go, who would get them out, from where would they exit. All of that was taking place. Also, keep in mind that most of the groups and forces in Lebanon, and there were other major militias, major communities. There was the Syrian army there. None of them, except for some of the smaller group of militias, really were fighting strongly with or in support of the PLO. So there are a lot of players in the country which wanted to see, including the Syrians, which had their army in Lebanon, who wanted to see the PLO out. You have none of those forces in Gaza.
According to Sarah Parkinson, Israel did eventually force the PLO and its guerrillas to withdraw, but only after killing at least 6,775 Beirut residents, among them more than 5,000 civilians. She talks about warfare in refugee camps, urban warfare in these large refugee camps. There weren't just tent cities, right? I mean, there was an infrastructure here that the PLO had been building up. Some of it was rather bloody. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Fighting in and around the camps continued after the 1982 war, settling of scores among Palestinian militias, among Syrian-backed groups against some of the Palestinian militias, some of the Shiite militias, later fighting against Palestinian militias. Keep in mind, as you mentioned, this was a free-for-all sectarian and political civil war. The camps themselves, they became basically, elaborate shanty towns. Palestinians were never given the right to work, never given the right to own property in Lebanon, which was very controversial and something I think was a terrible decision by Lebanon. The civilians, at least, were stuck in these camps, which were basically glorified shanty towns, trying to get by as best they can. But the PLO had moved out of the camps during the Civil War and was allied with other militias. And as you had mentioned yourself, ran alongside some of its allied militias, ran kind of half the country. A little bit like Hezbollah does today in big parts of Lebanon.
Yeah.
But the PLO did not have the technology or did not sort of build the elaborate infrastructure per se, particularly the tunnels and so on that Hamas has done. Maybe they didn't need it at the time. Maybe they didn't think of it. They didn't have a massive infrastructure of that kind, a military infrastructure of that sophistication.
Yeah. I said infrastructure. That's probably the wrong word to use. More of an apparatus. There was a governance and social service apparatus in Lebanon that the PLO created in the camps. So there was very bloody fighting. Some of the Palestinian units held up pretty well under the Israeli invasion. And even though the PLO does withdraw, they go to Tunisia, Palestinian militia units did reconstitute themselves during and after the 1982 invasion.
The PLO dominated Lebanon between 1975 and 82. After 82, it was no longer neither the PLO nor other, small ragtag Palestinian militias no longer played any prominent or dominant role.
Okay.
So it was fairly decisive in that sense. The country was still in the midst of a civil war, was divided. There was an area which was dominated by these so-called Christian militias that we talked about. And then the areas which the PLO had previously controlled then began to be controlled by the Amal movement, which is the Shiite movement of the time. It still exists today. You also have at that time, and this is a whole other story, the founding of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah gradually become by far the dominant players in all of South Lebanon, which used to be controlled by the PLO, and they become the major players. So really the PLO and the Palestinians did largely disappear from the scene after 1982.
But the Hezbollah angle here is really important, because if it's true that the 82 war and today's war share something in common, and that is that there's no military solution to this problem. The rise of Hezbollah is a perfect example of that, an unintended consequence. You now have a resistance movement to the Israeli presence in Lebanon, because Israel did not leave right away. They stayed for a while, and they stayed in southern Lebanon for many, many years, almost 20.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, keep in mind, again, there's other history happening at the time. The Islamic Revolution in Iran happened in 79, then began to mobilize and galvanize and arm and train Shiite groups around the region. One of the biggest, places where that exists is in southern Lebanon. And you have the rise of Hezbollah. Because the Israelis, followed the 82 invasion with an extended occupation that lasted for 18 years, then it gave incentive for Lebanese who were now under Israeli occupation to turn to Hezbollah to help them liberate their towns and villages. It's important also to note that in the very early days, Israel, in the early days when the PLO was still there, Israel, encouraged and thought, great, this is an Islamic movement that'll help push against the PLO. Similarly, in the early days, Israel kind of encouraged Hamas because they wanted a way to weaken the PLO. Similarly, as you know, the Americans encouraged the radical Islamic jihadis in Afghanistan to fight against the Soviets. So you talk about unintended consequences, they're all over the place.
Another important difference to point out is how the United States reacted to each of these wars. The reaction to the siege of Beirut, as I mentioned, Israel killed with the shelling of that city many thousands of people. At the time, and I'm reading this from William Inboden's book on Ronald Reagan, the peacemaker, Reagan is meeting with his team, his national security team. He's talking to Jeane Kirkpatrick, who interjects, the PLO is not a bunch of agrarian reformers. They're international terrorists who are working against U.S. interests and committing acts of violence throughout the world supported by the Soviet Union. Reagan agreed with her and asserted the need to expel the PLO from Lebanon. But then Reagan rewrote a draft letter to Menachem Begin and read it to his team. He blamed Israel's aggression for the latest impasse and concluded with a threat shorn of the usual diplomatic finesse. The relationship between our two countries is at stake. He recalled the newspaper photo of an infant injured by Israeli bombing, and there was also the use of white phosphorus, I might add, in that war. Reagan ended the meeting in disgust. I'm getting extremely tired of a war whose symbol has become a burned baby with no arms. He was on the phone with Begin, saying, you're causing a Holocaust in Beirut. That did not sit well with Prime Minister Begin, the invocation of World War II and the Holocaust to describe what Israel was doing in Lebanon. My point here is, Paul, sorry for this long question. Reagan was furious with what was going on, and he actually cut off transfers of arms, a shipment of cluster shells to Israel. How would you compare that to how the Biden administration has dealt with Israel today?
Well, first of all, the invasion itself, there was a lot of misunderstanding. Most U.S. officials say that they were not informed, they were not clued into what was happening. So that is an important point. It seemed a very, very, exaggerated, obviously it was, operation against the assassination of a diplomat. Even so, it took a while for Reagan to really get angry in this way and to really put his foot down. It did not happen, in the first week or two. Very different than Gaza, which, that war started with a Hamas attack and, as we all know, killing 1,200 Israelis. So that's where it started. Whereas the Israeli war sort of was simply started by the Israelis, effectively, as a complete invasion of another country, a country with which the U.S. had excellent and diplomatic relations. This is not Gaza. This is Lebanon. Okay, it was in civil war, but it was not an enemy country. So very, very different circumstances. And I guess personalities matter. Reagan was a very self-assured, a very forceful character. I know that President Biden is increasingly feeling those. He did sympathize with the Israeli right to respond, but he's also definitely moved sympathetic to these images of babies, women, men being slaughtered, innocent people.
But Biden's critics would say that, okay, Israel has a right to defend itself, but after now several weeks of seeing entire neighborhoods flattened in Gaza, maybe northern Gaza will be uninhabitable for who knows how long. Those critics would say he's not doing enough to pressure Israel to cut it out.
Most of the world is demanding an immediate ceasefire. There's a lot of pressure on Biden to go there. He has refused to call for a ceasefire. He has certainly called, and there has been what is called a humanitarian pause to negotiate on hostages, but he's still holding firm, and he's kind of hostage to the position he took early on One was, he said, Israel's right to supposedly, quote unquote, defend itself. But he also described Hamas as, called it pure evil, and hence linking it to, a 9/11, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, those groups. Within that context, the objectives become very maximalist, and it's hard for him to walk that back. I think he absolutely has to. There is no military solution. The solution, and we haven't even talked at all about what the solution is. The solution is a political negotiation for two states, the Palestinian state and an Israeli state. Everybody knows basically that's the solution. Right now, that's not what we're fighting about.
Well, we're going to get to the two-state solution next. One more question about 1982. Would you say that the war was a disaster for Israel?
Well, I would say it's a disaster for Lebanon. Let's start that.
Oh, that's true. Yes.
Start that first.
Yes.
For the Lebanese, the killed, villages, towns, regions, and so on. It was a disaster for the Palestinian armed groups that were there. Many of them believed in, their cause and fighting for their country as well, their towns, their villages, which they were either kicked out of or fled in fear in 1948. So, that was a loss for them. The Israelis themselves do consider that their 82 war was a disaster. That's their reading, mainly because much of the political architecture of what was supposed to happen, a Lebanese government would then sign a peace treaty, and Lebanon would be an ally of Israel. None of that came to pass. It's a complicated story, but didn't happen. And then instead of, the PLO, they eventually got a much stronger foe, which was Hezbollah. So it was just a bunch of losses for Israel, as well as Israel losing a lot of international global sympathy, public opinion, as it is doing now.
The Sabra and Shatila refugee camp massacres that Israel will say facilitated by letting the Phalangist militias in after the assassination of Gemayel. Reagan gave a fairly ferocious criticism publicly of Israel on television after the Sabra and Shatila massacre. Of course, Lebanon was falling apart even more in 1982-83 with Hezbollah and the bombings of the CIA station there and also the Marine barracks. But back to the outcome of the war, it did influence Israeli politics. You get a Labor Party that by the late 1980s is more conciliatory or more open to negotiation with the Palestinians. Also by the late 1980s, Paul, the Palestinians had changed their tune to a degree. The PLO, they had realized that war or violence was not going to get them a state. And I think Arafat also realized that if he was going to get the United States to try to mediate something here, he had to recognize Israel and forswear the use of violence. The first Intifada, 1987, peters out in the early 1990s, and we get, the Oslo Accords. But we're so far away from that today. I mean, what kind of state would the Arabs even get at this point?
I think we're heading a little bit more back towards the idea of a two-state solution than we were before this war started. So from 1979 up till 2 months ago, the settlement of the West Bank was proceeding vigorously. The U.S. would occasionally complain about it, but basically the U.S. facilitated it, bankrolled it indirectly, protected Israel in the Security Council, protected it from international law, vetoed whenever Israel needed it. If anything, encouraged Israel's hubris and encouraged the right wing, because the more they took, the more America just looked the other way and continued to support and enable. Netanyahu could boast before this attack that his strategy is working. The West Bank is being settled, becoming really part of Israel. The Arab countries witnessed the Abraham Accords, were normalizing relations with Israel. The Palestinian cause was no longer an issue that anybody cared about, as Netanyahu that's his claim. And he had, and this is another difference with the PLO, Netanyahu had enabled and encouraged Hamas's presence and continued presence in the Gaza Strip. It served his purposes very well. It kept the Palestinians divided so that they could not present a politically united front. It also prevented the U.S. or other people from forcing him to negotiate for a two-state, because he would say, who am I going to negotiate with? The Palestinians are divided. Look at Hamas. They don't recognize us. And he, coordinating with the Qataris, would bring Qatari help to help finance, Hamas's presence in Gaza. It served his purpose. And So he was saying to his Israeli public, look, it's working. We're getting the West Bank. We're able to keep the Palestinian issue off the table. Nobody's talking about a two-state solution anymore. And Israel is living with prosperity and peace and security, and it's all working. As all of that has come horribly crashing down. So we're in a completely different world where none of that makes sense anymore. And hence, now you hear, again, talk of a two-state solution, whereas 2 months ago you did not.
True, but as I said, what kind of state would the Arabs even get at this point? Unless we could go through that very painful and difficult process of uprooting Jewish settlers from the West Bank, who now number in the hundreds of thousands. Israel did withdraw from Gaza and remove its settlers from Gaza, but there are relatively few compared to how many are in the West Bank.
That is true, but a number of things. First of all, there is no other solution. Just be completely clear about it. The no-state solution, which Netanyahu said was working, which was basically an apartheid occupation kind of state, did not work. And I think many Israelis recognize that trying to maintain, 7 million Jewish Israelis, maintain the occupation of 5 million, soon there'll be 6 million, soon there'll be 7 million, mainly Muslim Arabs, Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. That is not a strategy. It's not a solution. It didn't work. It isn't working, and it won't work. So that's a no-state solution. That doesn't work. A one-state solution, which many Palestinians are calling for, that's fine. Let's all be citizens of one state, and we'll live together like old Palestine, and we share the country. For Jewish Israelis, they say, no way. We want our Jewish state. For their historical reasons and so on. So for them, that's a no-go.
Some of the problems here are intractable.
Yes, but, hence, the only one that is potentially workable is a separation between, the majority Jewish and the majority Muslim Arab Palestinian nations, and they are different nations, a separation which you can call it a two-state, call it a confederation, call it a federal system. There are many clever ways to do it, but there is no other way. Yeah. And this is becoming more and more urgent. Now, definitely, the Israeli right wing rushed to make settlements on the West Bank and put them in obtuse locations to make the point that, no, it's not possible to have a Palestinian state anymore, so please don't talk to us about it. But, look, if they moved 1.2 million Palestinians in 3 days, I think, moving 200, 300,000 settlers with compensation, settlement, housing, and so on, some of them will remain in Israel, some of those settlements. That was the plan that was tabled a while ago. Palestine gets some alternative territory. So a lot of those settlers and settlements would stay. Some, yes, sorry, but some of them would have to move. Yeah, is it a little bit complicated? Yeah, it is a little bit complicated, but war forces you to think of actual solutions rather than no solution.
As someone once said to me, when it comes to the Middle East, it's always complicated.
Well, no, I want to push back against that because that has been what American policymakers have been saying when they've found themselves unable to stop the Israeli right wing from settling the West Bank. Since the U.S. found that it doesn't have the political capacity to do anything about it, George H.W. Bush tried a little bit.
Yeah, he tried to hold up a loan to Israel.
Hold up a loan. That was the extent of it. The fact of the matter is that the U.S., for many political reasons, is unable and has been unable to do anything about it. So rather than say, this is the solution and it can be done, given the weakness of the U.S. and inability to stop it, they say, it's complicated. It's, these Arabs and Jews, they'll never get along. There's nothing that can be done. The Israeli right wing just fine to say that it's complicated. It's not that complicated. It's just that there isn't the will to actually do it. And I hope that all of the killing of innocent Israelis and innocent Palestinians will give new reason to actually be brave and find a solution and not keep saying, it's complicated. There's not much that can be done.
I agree with that. And after the first Intifada, we did get a peace process because both sides realized that the violence wasn't sustainable.
Tried, as you said, the Oslo Accords, We didn't mention the Madrid peace process that the U.S. and Secretary Baker and President Bush were really fantastic in putting together. That was 30 years ago. What's different today is that the influential Arab countries, mainly the Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, and so on, and Bahrain and all of those, in addition to Egypt and Jordan, all want normal relations with Israel. None of them is in any way seriously hostile to Israel. They want the Palestinians to get their due, but they want to be, friends of Israel. This was not the case decades ago. This is an opportunity for Palestinians as well as for Israelis, because a Palestinian authority, then a Palestinian state, which would be established in today's conditions, would be embedded in a group of Arab states, moderate Arab states, pro-Western Arab states, all of whom either have peace treaties or want peace treaties with Israel. This is a historic opportunity that the Palestinians can't afford to miss and the Israelis can't afford to miss. Such a development will also sideline and weaken Iran's narrative and Iran's proxies who, are thriving on, the situation of the Palestinians. If the Palestinians had a good situation embedded in a nice, moderate Arab coalition of forces allied with the U.S., this would leave Iran much weaker. Iran on the outside, that's another advantage of this moment. So I think this is a big opportunity. I know there are many people in Israel who think the same. There needs to be political change in Israel, which is likely to happen very soon. I don't think Netanyahu is going to survive this. And Israel should turn in a different direction and begin looking at the opportunities that can be seized, not just the punishment that can be meted out.
My fellow Americans, the scenes that the whole world witnessed this past weekend were among the most heartrending in the long nightmare of Lebanon's agony. Millions of us have seen pictures of the Palestinian victims of this tragedy. There's little that words can add, but there are actions we can and must take to bring that nightmare to an end. It's not enough for us to view this as some remote event in which we ourselves are not involved. For our friends in Lebanon and Israel, for our friends in Europe and elsewhere in the Middle East, and for us as Americans, this tragedy, horrible as it is, reminds us of the absolute imperative of bringing peace to that troubled country and region. By working for peace in the Middle East, we serve the cause of world peace and the future of mankind. For the criminals who did this deed, no punishment is enough to remove the blot of their crime. But for the rest of us, there are things that we can learn and things that we must do. The people of Lebanon must have learned that the cycle of massacre upon massacre must end. Children are not avenged by the murder of other children.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, somewhat related to what we're talking about here, because both sides in the Israel-Hamas war have invoked World War II, Nazis, the Holocaust, genocide to defend their positions. Well, there's a new documentary on Netflix called Ordinary Men. It's about a German police unit in World War II that became mass murderers of Jews. We're going to speak to Thomas Kuhn, an expert on the Holocaust, about that, and apply that documentary, if we can, to what's happening today. That is next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.